Next Tuesday on Zoom, I hope to run through basically Philo's main objections to the argument from design. This is Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion, which are devastating. A real barrage of refutations. And go on to Hume's canonical formulation of the problem of evil. And then we're going to work, not on Tuesday, but as time goes on, work to see if there can be any good response to the problem of evil as a refutation of the existence of God. But I thought I would focus today on an interlude, you might say, around the end of part 3 and the beginning of part 4. Concerning an issue that, and Hume uses this term, the question of anthropomorphism. How similar is God, if any, if there is God, to humans? My AirPods are asymmetrical. Because notice that the argument from design rests everything on an analogy between divine and human intelligence. Right, okay. I mean, it rests everything on the analogies like the universe to a house, the eye to a watch, the creation of God to the creation of a human being. At least in these formulations, like I said, it may be possible to give other formulations of the argument from design that do not rest this heavily on an analogy to human making, but intentional making. But these versions definitely do, and the usual ones do, I guess. Now, okay, so one problem is we are finite, not perfectly good intelligences. Are we saying that that's true of God? Or is that what kind of God emerges when your only knowledge of God is, or God's qualities, is through these analogies to human manufacture, right? And this is interesting now because Philo, the skeptic or possibly fideist or possibly atheist, and Demia, the orthodox divine, both attack Cleanthes, who is the reasonable, enlightened proponent of the argument from design or natural theology, on these grounds that the God that he's going to give us is way too anthropomorphic, like we're using ourselves as a model for the universe. And especially Demia, we can now appeal to scriptural authority and rich traditions about the incomprehensibility of God, the excess of God to any human categories, and so on. Right? Or the tradition of negative theology, where we can only say negative stuff about God because otherwise we make him too much like ourselves, which is an expression of like God is not finite. God is not stupid. Okay. Or whatever. So when we say that God is all-knowing, perhaps we're just kind of modeling God on what we wish about ourselves or some faculty of ourselves. When we say God is not ignorant, we're just kind of withdrawing some finite property or whatever. Okay. So what kind of God is yielded by the argument from design? And is it okay? Or is it what we want, I guess you'd say. So Philo says, and this is in part 2, this is page 210 of our text actually, Philo, directing this at Cleanthes, who's just formulated the argument from design. I was from the beginning scandalized, I must own, with this resemblance which is asserted between the deity and human creatures. That's what I'm calling anthropomorphism, the resemblance of the deity and human creatures, and must conceive it to imply such a degradation of the supreme being as no sound theist could endure. Which is not to say that he himself, Philo, is a sound theist. He's just saying, like, anybody who is like a traditional Orthodox theist, like Demea here, should be worried about that. God as analogous to a human architect, watchmaker, or whatever. That's kind of blasphemous, right? Are we worshiping a deity or one another or ourselves? With your assistance, therefore, Demea, that's Philo, I shall endeavor to defend what you justly call the adorable mysteriousness of the divine nature. It's incomprehensible. All you can do is adore, not think that you can understand what God is. That's the position here, and that is a possible Orthodox position, depending on what sect you might be in. And I shall refute this reasoning of Cleanthes on that ground, that it gives you this anthropomorphic deity. Right, okay. So now Cleanthes, at the beginning of part 3, gives another series of analogies, books, a voice from the sky, etc. All right, all of which like talk about human intelligent action as an analogy to God's creation and sustaining of the universe. So this is Demea talking, the Orthodox divine, on page 217. Your instance, Cleanthes, said he, drawn from books and language, and also we could also go watches and clock, watches and houses, etc. Being familiar has, like looking at the book of nature. That's one of the analogies that they're going for right now. Look at the book of the world. God is the author of this book. If we examine it closely, maybe even describing it scientifically, that's Cleanthes' view, then we're reading the book, God's book. That's an analogy. And, and if you found a book, of course you would, and started reading it and it made sense, you'd infer that it was intelligently authored, okay, or authored by an intelligent creature or conscious creature or whatever. Your instance drawn from books and language, being familiar, has, I confess, so much more force on that account. But is there not some danger, too, in this very circumstance? And may it not render us presumptuous by making us imagine that we comprehend the deity? Like, this is an expression of pride. Now we understand what the deity is. He's something like us. Right? That's a multi-dimensional expression of the sin of pride. And have some adequate idea of his nature and attributes. When I read a volume, I enter into the mind and intention of the author. I become him in a manner for that instant, and have an immediate feeling and conception of those ideas which revolved in his imagination while employed in that composition. Because I and the author of this book, after all, are similar creatures with similar kinds of consciousness. And so we can share and understand through language one another. Okay. Now, can we communicate with a being that is, an infinite being, or a being whose intelligence is perfect or something like that? Like, well, it's sure not much like reading someone else's book someone's written. But so near an approach we can surely never make to deity. His ways are not our ways. This is just a sermon or whatever. His attributes are perfect, but incomprehensible. Incomprehensible. And this volume of nature, the book of nature, contains a great and inexplicable riddle, more than any intelligible discourse or reasoning. And so one thing we're actually objecting to here, both Philo and Demea, is to Cleanthes' reasonableness, apparent reasonableness. Philo thinks that reason is not going to get you very far on these questions at all. That's a kind of Hume position, actually. And Demea thinks that reason is edging into blasphemy, especially here, where we're thinking we understand the world and hence understand God. Okay. Um, and so then now we make some observations. Demea makes some observations on the disanalogy of human and divine intelligence. The whole last paragraph on 217. Actually, I'll read a little bit of it. Now, as to the manner of thinking, our way of thinking and God's way of thinking, how can we make any comparison between them or suppose them anywise resembling? Our thought is fluctuating, uncertain, fleeting, successive, and compounded. And it would be just the same, it's just the same when you read a book. And were we to remove these circumstances, if our thinking was not fluctuating, uncertain, fleeting, successive, and compounded, not think about that for a second, not successive, for instance, not successive, not in time, we absolutely annihilate its essence. And it would so say you yank thinking out of time and fluctuation and going from one thing to another in a sequence, like an argument, for instance. What kind of reasoning do you have now? Nothing that we can understand, that's for sure. And it would, in such a case, be an abuse of terms to apply the name of reasoning, to apply to it the name of thought or reason. And to apply the name of thought and reason to it is just to take ourselves as a model for God. At least if it appear more pious and respectful, as it really is, still to retain these terms when we mention the Supreme Being, to say that God's reason is perfect or something like that, we ought to acknowledge that their meaning in that case is totally incomprehensible. When we talk about God's intelligence, and maybe we kind of need to retain some kind of analogies, but we need to acknowledge that when we talk about God's intelligence, we're talking about something totally incomprehensible. But then let's leave you with the problem. How can you talk about something totally incomprehensible? You claiming to speak of something totally incomprehensible, and you're throwing around properties of it, right? How about the name itself, God or whatever? Do you understand what that name designates? Well, not if you're sitting there starting out with, this is totally incomprehensible beyond all human capacities. Right? That's this dilemma. If God, and this could be an independent argument in some ways too, addressed to natural theology. If God's intelligence is similar to ours, we have no reason to attribute perfection or infinity to it. That would be blasphemous. But if it's not similar to ours, then God is incomprehensible, as Demea flatly asserts here. And it's senseless even to assert that he exists. What exists? And I mean, one thing that Hume is doing here is dealing with a way that theists, maybe who are not of a philosophical bent necessarily, behave when they get cornered, really cornered by well, it's a mystery and we don't understand. Okay. And you can see how someone like an Enlightenment philosopher, especially someone like David Hume, was just a killer of reason. Go like, oh, okay, you know, you've really given up the argument now. In fact, you've even said that what you are yourself saying about God is meaningless. So, am I going to have an argument with you now? Because you've just made all terms of argument impossible, but then you've just rendered what it is you're claiming to believe or teach meaningless. Okay, just explicitly, it's incomprehensible. All right, time to shut up then, right? uh, what is it you're adoring? To whom or what are you praying? Something incomprehensible about which we can say nothing. True? Interesting. Um, now this is how Cleanthes replies in just these terms that I've been setting this up. This is Cleanthes' reply, and I one lovely thing about Hume's dialogues is that different characters take up the burden or of the argument at different points. I must say that I think makes it superior to the Socratic dialogue by and large, where you definitely get a mouthpiece for Plato. I mean, maybe you do with Philo and Hume, but at different moments, actually, both Cleanthes and Demea uh, carry the thrust of the argument, and it's nice. And you get this whole zone where uh, by the end, all the arguments have been effectively refuted one way or another. Different characters like different kinds of arguments or different arguments, and different characters like to refute those different kinds of arguments. So by the end, though, they're all kind of laying there twitching these arguments. So this is how Cleanthes responds to this thing about the incomprehensibility of God. It seems strange to me, said Cleanthes, that you, Demea, who are so sincere in the cause of religion, should still maintain the mysterious, incomprehensible nature of the deity, and should insist so strenuously that he has no manner of likeness or resemblance to human creatures. It seems to me like when you withdraw that, Demea, maybe you would withdraw any contact that we could ever hope to have with this, whatever you're talking about when you talk about God. The deity, I can readily allow, possesses many powers and attributes of which we can have no comprehension. So he has faculties and powers that we definitely can't fully understand. But if our ideas, so far as they go, be not just and adequate and correspondent to his real nature, I know not what there is in this subject worth insisting on. If we can't say like God is good, okay, or God is intelligent, what is religion now? If we can't say things like that, is it supposed to provide moral guidance, for instance? Well, God's morality is not our morality, and it's completely incomprehensible. Okay, so how's that going to help? Um, and actually, maybe God's morality is completely incomprehensible, as when he supposedly asked Abraham to sacrifice his beloved son Isaac, and then withdrew him at the last minute. Didn't seem like a good thing to do, maybe, or what he did to Job. Is the name God without any meaning of such mighty importance? Or how do you mystics, this is a mystical view, God is beyond all human capacity to understand, who maintain the absolute incomprehensibility of the deity, differ from skeptics and atheists, who assert that the first cause of all is unknown and unintelligible? This is a brutal accusation, and you can sort of picture Demea bridling at it, like he's saying, okay, so the view that we can say nothing positive or comprehensible about God, for example, about his moral qualities, right, or his intelligence, uh, Cleanthes is asserting that is the atheist position. Okay, like how do you differ from atheism? How, why? I can't even tell whether you're affirming or denying the existence of God because I have no idea what you're talking about, and you're asserting that you have no idea what you're talking about. So, time to lapse into silence. Okay. Their temerity must be very great, their arrogance, if, after rejecting the production by a mind, the production by a mind, I mean a mind resembling our own, for I know no other, they pretend to assign with certainty any other specific intelligible cause, and their conscience must be very scrupulous indeed if they refuse to call the universal unknown cause a god or deity. Or so, yeah. So say if I was just an atheist, and like the claim is, you're saying like, my response to the cosmological argument is just there is no explanation. I don't care. I'm not giving an explanation. We cannot grasp any explanation. So time to stop trying. Okay. Um, isn't that what you're saying? All right. Um, okay. So, all right. So I guess I'll kind of leave it there. Um, I mean, one thing I'll say is like, so Cleanthes allows that God, that we can't fully grasp God's intelligence or power or goodness, and that there might be other faculties that we can't even name. Okay. Like God is radically in excess to our intelligence, but if God's intellect is not analogous to our intellect, then we've got no grounds to characterize it in any way, including that it's there at all. All right. Anyway, uh, on the other hand, okay, isn't it arrogant to think that if there were an infinitely powerful and intelligent being, whatever that exactly means, that we could grasp it? Maybe, I mean, the mood of the Hume is not, well, maybe it gets us at the end in a way. Um, Maybe that has power as something as something to experience, or as a way to open ourselves to something we can't understand, and also a way to repudiate, or not repudiate, but qualify the arrogance of our own intelligence, so that we might hope to meet with something else. I mean, maybe we struggle by these analogies to say something, but maybe there is some place that we're headed, or some being with which we might make contact, but not through a series of rational arguments. That's probably is what someone like Demea thinks. Um, do you see what I mean? Like the idea that God is mysterious is an acknowledgement of our finitude, and it directs you toward experiences or ways of trying to get access to God, or make contact with God, that are not sort of channeled by rationality, because the idea might be that rationality, um, our rationality can only get us so far, and it's not necessarily God's rationality. Okay. So, I think that perhaps Demea, perhaps Philo, and maybe certainly Demea, don't like Cleanthes' approach, and don't like the argument from design as a route to God, because it doesn't uh, suggest a kind of adoration, and it does represent a sort of pride in human reason that we would associate with the Enlightenment, but that maybe precludes making contact with God, who might be accessible to other faculties, but not to reason. All right. Well, that gets us into the faith and reason debate. And that we will deeply enter into, I hope, with Kierkegaard and James and others. And then the question is how we ought to believe. The question for Kierkegaard is something like, how does God want us to believe? Right? But this idea that the way to come to believe, and maybe even the way to worship, is to experience the world as God's creation, to experience specific things in the world, attributing them to the intelligence of God, and then thinking that we grasp the world as a system and hence have a handle on God's intelligence. That's only one possible route for religious experience, right? And it's a sort of the scientific deistic route that people are running now, as Hume writes, or have been running for 100 years, since at least Descartes. Um, but that sort of rational theism, which is what Hume's book is about, is only one dimension of, say, the intellectual and spiritual traditions of the monotheisms. Uh, can there be mystical experience? What is that? Could there be an ineffable experience of God or of anything else, something that cannot be expressed in words? Okay, something that gives us access to uh, arenas of understanding that could be beyond our verbal capacities. These are fascinating questions, right? Um, and in a way, Hume's dialogues leaves those open at the end. What he thinks he's done by the end is shown the limits of reason to bring us to God. And you could read that as showing that we're not getting to God, if there is such a thing, and we don't even understand what that means. Or you could say, like what he's showing by the end, if he refutes Cleanthes in the course of the dialogues, is that we're going to have to find a road to God other than reason, which would entail, for example, that there are truths inaccessible to reason, or there might even be realms of human experience that are compromised or foreclosed by an excessive devotion to reason. I think that perhaps Demea and Philo are also a little bit disgusted by the idea of God as primarily a reasoner. Maybe they think of reason as kind of small in a way. And Hume has a really interesting position with regard to that. Is that he's the most reasoning creature that God has ever made. He's a beautiful reasoner, and it's almost every sentence in Hume is a celebration and a expression of reason. But he's also someone who really thought that reason is quite limited, and that most of what we have to get by with in real life has nothing to do with reason. And maybe that's where he ends up in the end. Like, believe or don't believe. But don't pretend that you got where you got by reason, because reason ain't going to get you either to either place. Actually, maybe reason will get you to disbelief for Hume. Depends on how heavily we nail the problem of evil, or what we think of the status of that is in the dialogues. But even there, you could get to the point of saying, like, well, reason actually strongly suggests that God does not exist. Probably not. Here's the problem of evil. Okay. If God is omnipotent, he can prevent evil. If God is benevolent, then he wants to prevent evil, but there is evil. So there is no God. Okay. But now, could there be a faith against reason. And how would we defend that or describe it? How does it emerge? Where does it come from? Could it be a legitimate believing attitude in any case? On the other hand, can we live without faith, without a whole body of beliefs that we can't not necessarily rationally defend? All right. So that discussion opens up a bunch of the later elements that we'll be discussing in the course. But I thought I'd do this thing about God's incomprehensibility.